Alright, today we are going to take a look at what I call Box 5, the major root box. And so far I've taken a look at boxes 1 through 4, and I hope that you've been able to pick up some stuff about how to use them together. But Box 5 is really one of the most important ones, and it really has not much to do with blues music, believe it or not. But the reason that I'm teaching Box 5 the way that I am is because if you look back through the history of blues music, even guys like Albert King had some more kind of love song style songs that they would play. And the blues scale, as it's normally played, doesn't play quite as well in those types of songs. So Box 5 that I'm teaching is going to be a key thing that you can use whenever you're playing a song that has a little bit more melody to it. Examples would be songs like Life Without You by Stevie Ray Vaughan, or Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton and stuff like that. And Box 5 is a place where a lot of riffs that you'll hear played in some of those songs are played here. Anyway, the first thing I want to do is I just want to play just some samples of different songs that you might recognize that have riffs that are in Box 5. I'm tuned down to E flat, as I am for all these lessons. So if you're in standard tuning, you might want to tune down to E flat, because I'm going to be doing some stuff in the open key of E flat today. Take one. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to show you a couple of examples from different songs that use Box 5 as part of their melody, or even some lead stuff. The first song is a thing called Yellow Ledbetter by Pearl Jam, and they played that. They probably were playing it in the open key of E, but I'm tuned down to E flat. So anyway, they used Box 5 for the opening part of that riff, or the opening part of that song. And they dropped to the 5 chord there, but the opening part of that song, that's a very Hendrix style thing. That's kind of where they got the sound for that song from, and that's right inside of Box 5. Let's see, an example of a song where you can play some lead in this box would be the song Life Without You by Stevie Ray Vaughan. When he launches into the solo, he's basically dropping down to the 5 box from the 1 box in that song, and he launches into something like... So that should give you an example of what kind of things you'll hear played out of Box 5. So now I'm going to move on to just showing you the structure of Box 5 and how it relates to the other 5 boxes that we've been talking about. For this lesson, I'm going to be changing to the key of E flat, because Box 5 is a really important part of playing some songs that are in this key. But when you're in the key of E flat, and again, I'm tuned down half a step on all strings, so for me, E flat's an opening tuning. The Box 1 that I talk about would be down here. And then the Albert King box would be right above it, Box 2. Then Box 3, the B.B. King box. Then Box 4, the Clapton box, as I call it. And then right at the very top of the whole pattern, we've got Box 5. So you can see the little chart on the screen shows you how I define box 5. And you can see that box 4 overlaps it by a couple notes here. And that it shares 3 notes with box 1. And this brings up an interesting topic. One thing that I haven't said a whole lot about is that if you think of all these boxes as one continuous pattern, once you get to the top of box 5, you just start them all over again. Box 1, box 2, box 3, and basically as high as you can go there. But box 5 shares 2 notes with box 1 above it. And then of course the root note down here as well. Alright, so that's the main structure of box 5. Now I want to get into, kind of what the purpose of each individual note in this box is. That way you'll kind of know what their priorities should be when you're playing. Alright, in box 5 we have the interesting situation of the very top note being the root note of the key that we're playing in. Like I said, I'm playing in the key of A flat, or E flat. So this is just E flat an octave up. And the very top note of box 5 right here is E flat. So one thing that box 5 is used for is kind of a walk down over the major scale. The major scale is kind of contained within box 5. And so the first couple notes of box 5, they kind of outline the major scale without, you leave out these 2 notes. So those 2 notes are kind of left out by the outline of the box. But a common purpose here is to do a walk down over these notes. And you can get a real nice lead in to that walk down by raking all the strings and palm muting as you go. And only letting that top note ring out. So that's usually kind of what this note is used for. Also, depending on where you're at in the song, you can bend that up to this note. And you can kind of land on it anywhere that the root note would be appropriate in the song. Alright, let's drop down to this note here. And this is kind of a transitional note. You don't start or end a whole lot of things here, but you just kind of walk over them and use them as kind of stepping stones to riffs or notes below. So let's drop down to the note right below the root note. This is a pretty cool note because it's very much like in the B.B. King box we talked about. There's a note in there that is kind of, depending on what chord you're in the sequence, you can end a bend there. Well, same thing applies here. If you remember the song, I'm trying to think what, I think it was called While We Cry by Kenny Wayne Shepherd. He had borrowed a lot of chords from the Pearl Jam song, that song. But when he would start his soloing, he would do this bend right here. So there's a use right there. You see it matches right in with the root note. So while you're playing on the 1 chord. Alright, so let's drop down to this note. This is very much like the note above it. It's just kind of a stepping stone as you do one of these walk downs. So it's kind of a utility. Doesn't get a whole lot of love. It's not the focus point of a whole lot of stuff, but you got to know to hit it when you're walking down. It gives you a nice flow. Alright, well let's drop down to this note right here. Now, you know, if you're smart and you've watched the other lessons, you probably know that box 1 is, I outline it as the exact same shape as box 5. And in box 1, which, you know, repeats right at the top here, the note in the same position as the one I'm focusing on here, it's a lot used in bends a lot. Well, it's important to realize that even though box 5 mimics the shape of box 1, the notes are all different in terms of where you are relative to the root. In box 1, the root note is at kind of the left-hand side of the box, so that when you slide down to box 5, now the root note's kind of at the top of the box, so even though this note is used a lot in bending, it has different sound when you do it because we're kind of playing in the major scale here. So this note is used a lot in bending. And if we move right down to the note below it, you can see that now we've landed at the root note again. So this will be a common place for ending a riff, just like that same corresponding note in box 1 was. That has a little bit different sound in it. But it's like if you learn that same riff once, you can use it in 2 places. Alright, so like I've been talking about, there's kind of a walk-down pattern that's used a lot in this box. So you can incorporate the bend there. Good place to end the riffs here with a vibrato. Alright, let's drop down to this note. As you can kind of tell on some of what I've been doing, I kind of have a back and forth pattern going between the root note. You know, it's funny though. If I go down to the B.B. King box in E flat, I talked about how these 2 notes are kind of like a call and response kind of thing. Well, it's the same thing in box 5 here. You're just down a string and obviously up farther on the neck. But it's kind of this note is usually used in combination with the root note, which is kind of the focus point of those riffs. Now, let's drop down another whole step. This is kind of a lead-in note. So you can start here, but it sounds a little bit fuller if you can start with this note. And let's drop down to this note. This is also kind of a lead-in note, but kind of in a different way. You can slide to this note, kind of walk your way up. And let's drop another whole step. Now you can walk up from here, or slide from here. And you can see that all these notes down here, they're all kind of supporting notes for the focus of this box, which is kind of the root note. Alright, so now let's drop down to the root note down here. It isn't used, I included it in box 5 just to show that it's kind of the same pattern as box 1, but this note really is not used a whole lot. And the reason is that there's kind of an auxiliary note to box 5 down here, which is the same note as the note in box 5, but it's much more useful for sliding in. So you hardly ever will like come all the way down box 5 and like end it there. And likewise the note down here. This note isn't used a whole lot in the context of Box 5 itself, but it's used together with some of the auxiliary notes I'm going to talk about later. That's kind of a way to get into Box 5. So the bulk of what you play in Box 5 is done with and a couple of auxiliary notes out here. Alright, so that gives you kind of a purpose for each of the main notes in this box, and that's going to be the end of the free lesson. If you head over to steviesnacks.com and you pick up the full lesson, it's going to be in high definition, and what I'm going to cover is how to use some of these outside notes, how you kind of get into Box 5, how you can slide from Box 5 into Box 1. Cover some of those transitions there. I'm also going to talk about kind of the hidden chord inside of Box 5. Kind of the Hendrix hammer-on chord technique that you'll hear so many people using there. And then also in the full version, I'm going to be talking about some of the minor scale notes in Box 5. And I don't use them a whole lot, but it's good to know because they tie into Box 4 a little bit. So there's a bunch of more stuff in the full-length version lesson that you can buy for $5 over at steviesnacks.com. You get a high-definition QuickTime download of the lesson, and when you have the QuickTime version, you can put it in slow motion and pick out some of the riffs that I don't have time to teach individual notes on. So hopefully that'll give you a better idea of what Box 5 is used for, and if you kind of want to take it to the next level, head over to steviesnacks.com and pick up the full version. Alright, if you're watching this, that means that you bought the full lesson and you are in for a treat. I'm going to get into, right now, talking about some of the hidden notes of the major scale inside of Box 5. First one I'll look at is this note right here. And like I said before, this note is sometimes used when you're doing kind of a fancy walk down on the major scale. And you got to get used to playing some hammer-ons and pull-offs there. So that's kind of a note that you can use. The other one I want to talk about is right here. It's kind of the other missing note in the major scale. This note's pretty handy for you can do some interesting stuff there by hammering onto it, or as part of this whole kind of walk down thing there. And the other one I want to talk about is actually kind of an auxiliary note. And if you get into more melodic playing, if you think about the root note here, it's actually just an octave down from the hidden note that I talked about here. So just know that you can kind of slide to that if you're going to continue walking down. Alright, let's talk about some hidden minor notes in the major root box, Box 5. And, you know, the outline of Box 5 is right here. But if you shorten that up by 1 fret, move this note up 1. So, people who are associated with, you know, the normal blues shapes are sometimes confused by how I draw Box 5, because, well, that's not a normal blues shape. But the reason is that if you look at the blues pentatonic scale inside this box, I can't think of a single riff that you do that uses those notes in this position on the fretboard. That's why I teach Box 5 as a major scale box. There's a lot more that you can do knowing that, and then if you need to get some minor scale blues out of it, just is real awkward trying to play stuff there, and Stevie played almost nothing in those box in the minor scale position in here. So this note right here, you can get some minor blues stuff out of Box 5, but it's really not that useful, and the really only useful part of it is when you're coming from Box 4. You can bend the root note up a whole step and back down. But that's about it. So I'm not going to talk any more about the minor scale notes in Box 5 because I don't think they're very useful at all. And what I want to do is move on to what I've been talking about as the auxiliary notes. And that's just... These are kind of auxiliary notes to Box 5 because you can slide in real nice into Box 5. And while you're doing that, what you're doing, and you might not know it yet, is you're learning what I call the backdoor pattern that I'm going to cover in the next lesson. And that is kind of a way to slide right into Box 5. So if you go and look at my lessons on Lenny, when he does... what he's doing is sliding into Box 5 there. So these notes right here, you just kind of do a walk up and slide there. Alright, I'm going to talk about how you can transition in and out of Box 5 to kind of connect it with Box 1. I already talked about how you can slide in using some of these auxiliary notes. But now I'm going to talk about how you can move from Box 5 into Box 1 and back and forth. So in Box 1 I talked about kind of the secret double life of Box 1, and I taught this in the extended version of that lesson, so if you don't have that one I suggest that you go get it, because Box 1 I taught as a minor scale box. But I also talked about kind of the secret double life of Box 1. As, you know, kind of the major scale notes living inside there. And Box 5 I'm teaching as a major scale box, so it follows that since they are kind of back to back here, that when you're playing in Box 5, you should just slide right up on the G string here, right into those major scale notes in Box 1. And you can also slide down in much the same fashion, but when you're sliding back down, you can actually get a little bit more fancy. You can do a, you can start with that little hammer-on chord on Box 1. Follow it up by this chord that kind of spans Box 1 and 5 right here. And then slide right down into Box 5. All I'm doing there is holding those two notes and hammering on with my ring finger here. And then, so you can kind of travel back and forth there. Now, let's talk about a way that you can use part of Box 1 in Box 5. And this is an example from the song Life Without You by Stevie Ray Vaughan. And even though that song was in A flat and he was playing down here, I'm going to be playing again in the 5 box of E flat. And what he would do is he would start a bend on this note in the 5 box, like I talked about before. Sometimes he would bend it an extra half step. Alright, the last thing that I'm going to talk about in this lesson is what I'm calling the kind of hammer-on chord technique. And this is something that Hendrix used a lot, and everybody kind of copied him on it. And there's a chord hidden inside of Box 5 here. Now, if you think about being an E flat, this is obviously the root chord. Well, if you learn more about, chord theory and bar chord theory, you'll know that chords have different forms. For example, I believe that's called the E chord shape, because on standard tuning, that's kind of the open chord. That's how you play it. So when you're playing a bar chord, you keep the same basic form. But then there's the A chord shape. Well, kind of an extension of the A chord shape is to tack on this one. And it's called the A chord shape because it's down here in standard tuning at the A chord. Well, that chord shape in Box 5 is basically just the root chord played in a different shape. So that by itself isn't terribly interesting, but what you can do with it is hammer-ons on this note, this one, and even this one. And if you think about playing the chord by itself straight, just think about hammering on here. And so you start by playing these two notes, and just hammering on there with your ring finger. Then you drop down to these same two notes here, but this time hammering on this one, and then dropping out of these two notes, but hammering on here. Kind of play that note in with them. So that is immediately identifiable as that Hendrix kind of hammer-on style that he used so much. And Box 5 is the perfect place to learn that because it's used in the song Lenny by Stevie Ray Vaughan. And even in some of the riffs that he would play in Lenny. I taught a lesson on that a while back. But if you can learn this and master those kind of hammer-on techniques there, that's going to give you a great thing to use for rhythm playing. Because if you think about the chord by itself, I mean, that can get boring pretty quick, but if you add in you can really fatten up the rhythm part by doing that. And the last thing I want to talk about is so that's just an extra technique that you can use in Box 5. And just remember that when you're playing in Box 1, you drop down to Box 5. You got that chord right there at your disposal that you can use the hammer-ons with, and it really will give you kind of that Hendrix sound to your chord playing. So that's it for the lesson on Box 5, and the next lesson I'm going to teach talks about the backdoor pattern that I've been talking about from time to time. And so I hope that gives you some insight into Box 5, why I've laid it out the way that I did, and how you can use it to add some major scale playing and even chord playing to your overall style.